Hello and welcome to my second video on the eating behaviours topic. This one today we're going to look at dieting and the success and failure of dieting, and this is part of the AQA Unit 3 PSY A3 psychology specification for A2. As I mentioned last time, you first look in this one about eating behaviours in general, and if we quickly look at the spec, my last video was on the factors influencing attitudes to food and eating behaviour, and then this there under that second bullet point is the explanations for the success and failure of dieting. After this we'll look at the biological side of things in terms of neural mechanisms and the evolutionary explanations, and then finish off by looking at anorexia nervosa. So without further ado, let's look at success and failure of dieting. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to have a look at this white bear, and I want you to get a bit of paper and a pen or a pencil, and I want you to make a little note, a tally, every time you think of the white bear. I want you for the rest of this video to not think about the white bear. Try to not think about the white bear, but every time that you slip, make a little tally, and then later on in the video we'll see what relevance this has to the dieting topic that we're looking at the moment. Right, why dieting then? Well, the topic is eating behaviour, and obviously dieting has a big role to play in that. And actually dieting is a very, very common thing. Statistics saying up to about 90%, 89% of women diet at some point in their lives, slightly less for men, but dieting happens, and it's very popular, and I'm sure you've seen lots of adverts, and you're aware of lots of different diets that are out there. There's Weight Watchers, there's the 5-2, there's eating one particular food for a lot of time, the cabbage soup diet or the grapefruit diet or something like that. In general, all diets fall under these three categories. One is either you are restricting your total food intake, so that's kind of calorie counting. Two, you are restraining from certain foods, so you are stopping yourself eating the generally regarded as unhealthy foods, which are ones that tend to be high in fat, high in sugars, so chocolates and chips and crisps and things like that. Or there's fasting, so periods of not eating. Those are the three general types of diet. And so we're going to look at, well, what works, so obviously the success of dieting, but most often what doesn't work. A lot of these diets, you hear of yo-yo dieters, people that go on the diets and then gain the weight back again, and actually in Britain, in America, there's an obesity epidemic. So obviously there are lots of these diets out there, but they don't seem to be working. And so when we're looking at the failure of dieting, we're looking at, well, what are these diets and why aren't they working? What factors can we use to account for why these diets aren't working? And then we'll finish off by looking, well, what does seem to work a bit better. So we're going to start by looking at the restraint theory, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But actually the restraint theory doesn't tend to work. Again, there's denial, and that's another theory of dieting, and again shows the failure of dieting and why it doesn't work. And we kind of finish off with detail, and actually that seems to have a bit more success, so that's the success of dieting. Okay, so as I said, we'll start with restraint theory, and as restraint theory suggests, this is where you restrain from a particular type of food, or you restrain from the amount of food that you're usually eating. And again, this is the typical kind of Weight Watchers, Slimming World sort of diet. But actually what Herman and Max say is that restraint theory doesn't work. Quite often you go for these diets and they end up failing, so this leads to failure of dieting, and they've got quite an in-depth study that kind of looked into that and suggests why that may be the case. And actually what they say is that restraining for something might lead you to overeating because you're denying yourself. We'll look at this in context of the cognitive boundary model. Again, more of that in a second, and you'll understand how that fits into the theory. For this topic, a restrained eater, it's almost a scientific term for a dieter. So if I talk about a restrained eater, I'm talking about someone who's dieting, someone who's trying to limit their total intake of food, or stopping themselves eating particular foods. So what research has been done into this then? In Herman and Mack 1975, 45 female participants who were students were recruited into the study, and they were then split into 3 different groups, equal groups of 15 per group. In the first group, they were known as the no preload group. What that means will become clearer in a moment. The second group were again 15, and they were given 1 milkshake before they went into the main part of the study. The third group were given 2 milkshakes before they went into the main part of the study. I'll explain to you in a moment, but during the main part of the study they were asked to eat ice cream, so that's why these milkshakes were known as preloads, so they're loading them up on calories. So one group had no milkshakes, so they had no preloads, they went into eating the ice cream just as they were. The second group had 1 preload, so they had some calories, but not as much, obviously, as that third group who had 2 preloads. So they went into this third group with the 2 milkshakes, went into eating the ice cream, having already had a substantial amount of calories. Within each of these groups, they were then split further, and they were split into, within each group, so within the no preload group, within the milkshake group, and within the 2 milkshake groups, each group had a set who were restrained eaters and a set who were unrestrained eaters. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, restrained eaters basically means dieters, and unrestrained eaters means non-dieters. So within each group you had some that were dieting and some that weren't dieting. That information, whether they were dieting or not, was actually taken from them after the study, and hopefully it will become a bit more obvious why that was the case in a moment, and we'll speak about that. So 45 participants, 3 groups to begin with, so 15 in each group, and then within those groups you had some who were dieting, some who weren't dieting, and the 3 groups were no preload, so they hadn't eaten anything, 1 milkshake, so some calories, and then 2 milkshakes, so a substantial amount of calories. Okay, so the main part of the study then, all of the participants in all 3 of those groups, whether restrained or unrestrained, were given 3 different flavour tubs of ice cream, and they were told to eat them and rate them. But importantly, they were told that they could eat as much as they want, so however much it took for them to give a rating of their taste preference for these ice creams, they could eat as much as they wanted to, and that's what they were actually studying, and we'll see why this has you could probably start imagining already why this has an impact on kind of dieting behaviour. As I said, it was only afterwards that we discovered which ones in each group were dieting or not dieting. Basically the idea was, if they were asked before, are you dieting or not, that could have influenced their behaviour and influenced the results. So actually afterwards, they obviously just thought this test was a test of flavour preference in the ice creams, but actually Herman and Mack were testing dieting and restrained dieting. So what were the findings? What they found was the restrained eaters, so the dieters, from both the milkshake groups ate more ice cream than the dieters from the no milkshake group. So if they had already had some calories and they were then told to eat as much ice cream as they wanted, they would eat more than the ones who hadn't had any calories. What they also found is a bigger, stronger correlation after the 2 preloads. So if they had a substantial amount of calories already and then they were told to eat as much ice cream as they wanted, they tended to eat even more, which I guess on the face of it seems a bit strange, because you would think, oh well, they've already had their calories, maybe the ones that had more calories to begin with would eat less, but actually they found they ate more. So that's a bit of an interesting finding, and starts to explain to us why restraint might be a bad option when it comes to dieting. So yeah, basically the participants who were attempting to diet, then the more they ate after the 2 preloads. So this was known as the what the hell effect. Basically, the idea here is that if you're trying to diet and you're restraining yourself, you're saying, no, I'm not going to have as much food, I'm going to be good, I'm going to restrict the amount I eat, I'm going to restrict what I eat. If they are then given 2 milkshakes and they have to have these 2 milkshakes, they've already gone off course, haven't they? They've already busted their diet. So they then think, oh, what the hell? I've already had 2 milkshakes. What is 4 tubs of Ben & Jerry's gonna do? It's not going to be much worse, is it? And so this leads to it's known as the what the hell effect. The scientific term is behavioural disinhibition. So if you inhibit something, you're stopping. So when you're dieting, you're behaviourally inhibited. You're stopping yourself eating particular foods. Whereas disinhibition is you're not stopping yourself eating those foods. Whereas the ones that had no preload, they've been good already. They're on their diet, they're restrained. So they're going to say, offer the ice cream, eat as much as you want. Oh, well, no, okay, I'm going to still kind of stay within my boundaries. And that's actually what we then come to look at is called the boundary model, and we'll look at that in more detail in a second. Ogden has actually said that this is the case with people trying to give up smoking and drinking as well. And so people trying to quit smoking, if they have 1 cigarette, they often fall off the wagon and they'll have lots afterwards. Again, drinkers. And so that's why in Alcoholics Anonymous they have to completely abstain from drink rather than reducing the amount, because if they have 1 it then leads to more. And this is what we think happens with restrained eating, and why the restraint theory leads to the failure of dieting. And remember, that's the topic that we're kind of looking at, the success and failure of dieting. So one of those theories is the restraint model, and actually it leads to failure of dieting. Restrained eating and the restraint theory of dieting, the boundary model can be used. This model, as you can see here, suggests the body's set points and almost our drive. So on the one end you have the hunger drive, and obviously when we get to a certain state we become hungry, and that's a biological drive, you could say, that will allow us to survive in our environment. At the other end then you've got satiety, and that's where you feel full. So satiety is the point you get where you don't feel you can eat anymore. And in the middle you've got kind of the eating behaviour and eating actions, I guess. What this first model shows is unrestrained eaters. This would be someone who's not on a diet. So someone who's not on a diet would be hungry, and then they would eat until they feel full, and then they would stop eating. The arrows at the bottom have got what was found in the Herman and Mack study. So the no preload group, the group that didn't have any of the milkshakes to begin with, they would have obviously started at a point that's closer to hunger. So they would have started down here, and then they would have eaten probably more and gone up to satiety. The preload group will have started here. So if you've had 2 milkshakes, you may have started further up, but again you would eat till satiety, eat till you're full, and that's what was found with the unrestrained eaters, the ones that weren't on a diet. Eat until they're satisfied. This model describes what happened with the restrained eaters, the ones that are on a diet. The big thing that's different here is this cognitive boundary. So if you're on a diet, you will say to yourself, no, I'm only going to eat a certain amount, and that is often less than when you feel satisfied and satiety, because obviously you need to eat less to try and lose weight, to be on a diet, and so you enter this cognitive boundary, and so that's a mental set point. With the Herman and Mack, again, you can still see this down here. So the no preload group, the ones that didn't have the milkshakes, they were hungry, they were on a diet, they then ate the ice cream, but they would then stop when they reached their cognitive boundary. However, with the preload group, what happened was their 2 milkshakes will have sent them over their cognitive boundary, over the point where they thought, well, no, I need to be eating less to be on a diet and to lose weight. And so because they're already past that cognitive boundary, this is when the behavioural disinhibition kicks in, the what the hell effect. Oh, I've already reached that point, I might as well just keep eating. And that's when they would that's why they ate more after the preload. So the boundary model helps us explain the findings in Herman and Mack and the restrained eating. And I think those bullet points there just kind of emphasise that a bit. So that, together with the research, the investigation that we looked at, that kind of covers the first part of the success and failure of dieting. Obviously, we're saying the restraint theory leads to a failure of dieting. We need to evaluate that then, and actually a good way to do that is to look at some of the research methods that are involved here. So, in terms of methodology, methodological issues just means the methods that were used. We've already said the questionnaires asking about whether they were restrained eaters or not was given post hoc. Post hoc means after the event. So they were asked whether they were restrained eaters after they'd already had the milkshakes or not and had the ice cream. The reason for this is because if they were given this before, it would have affected the results. So they had to be given it afterwards. The trouble with that is what it led to is a poor distribution of dieters and non-dieters. So we said there was 15 in no preload, 15 in the 1 milkshake preload, and 15 participants in the 2 milkshake preload. But within there could have been, and there was an imbalance in restrained and non-restrained eaters. So you could have maybe only had within those 15 3 restrained eaters, for example. And so that leads to a bit of an imbalance, and again it might skew our results, possibly confounded by a couple of bits that we're going to look at in a second. A second problem is that it's correlational research, and you should know from AS that in correlational research you've got an issue with cause and effect. We don't know that one thing has cause and effect on another. We don't know which way round that relationship is. There could have even been a third variable. So for this one, it could be that it's a certain personality type that leads people to being both a high restraint and high food intake, and we don't know that it's the restraint that's necessarily leading to the high food intake. This links back to the point of kind of the distribution of people within the groups, and there's an issue there with kind of individual differences. Again, these were small groups, so what could have happened by pure fluke, you could have got the guys that were not going to eat as much ice cream randomly could have been in the no preload group anyway, and the ones that were always going to eat loads would have been in the restrained high preload group, and so the study doesn't really account for individual differences, because you've got an independent measure design. You're trying to measure one lot of people against another, and so that's a bit of an issue. As well as that, it's small sample size, so this doesn't give us enough power. Again, a better study would have a lot more people, so you have more reliable, more valid results. So that would have been a bit better, and again that links back to the methodology in terms of sampling and population. Other issues was suggested that there's potentially some ethical issues. Participants were university students. We've already said, again, you can maybe link that back to the methodological issues in terms of sampling bias. Do we know that this is how other people eat, other than just students? But the fact that they were students and they were given course credits for taking part in the study, and so they may have felt under duress maybe to take part in the study, it may have affected their right to withdraw. As well as that, they were deceived, so that goes against the BPS ethical guidelines of deceptions. However, it's less of a point because they were given a full debrief afterwards, and hopefully they were told that they could still take their data out if that was still an issue. So that was kind of an evaluation of the research. Looking back at the restraint theory then, so this is evaluating the theory that restraining your eating leads to failure of diets. And one of the big issues here is that what we've got really is a description. The restraint theory describes why dieting doesn't happen, but it doesn't explain why we become disinhibited. So we've said, oh yeah, the reason why restraint doesn't work is because people say what the hell, they become disinhibited and they eat anyway. But it doesn't explain why, and so that's one of the criticisms of the theory, is that it is a description and not an explanation. Other issues come when kind of trying to apply this theory to other areas in eating. So one of those areas would obviously have been obesity. So we would apply the idea of restraint to obesity, and again, what we would find is overeating may be a consequence of restraint, because often when people are obese, they are recommended to restrain their eating, to control what they're eating a bit more. And so they say, okay, well, don't eat as much, and then what you end up with is overeating. And so it could add to the problem of obesity. It's not saying that's why someone got obese in the first place, but what it's saying is that it's not going to help, because it could make people obese later on. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, and we look at eating disorders, where people are eating not as much, then the restraint theory has difficulty in explaining anorexia, basically, because people who are anorexic, they restrain, don't they? They eat very, very little, but they manage to do that, and they manage to not eat a lot and lose lots of weight, dangerously so, and end up with an eating disorder. So how does restraint theory, if restraint theory is the reason why diets and losing weight don't work, how does that explain anorexia nervosa? And it can't, and that's probably one of the main criticisms towards the restraint theory. So as a bit of an overview then, the body weight has this set point, as we looked at in the boundary model, and there's this inbuilt weight regulating system, kind of hunger and satiety and satisfaction, and so when you try and reduce that, and you reduce what the body needs, it kind of potentially kicks back and tries to restore it, and that's why you could overeat. That could maybe be more of an explanation, but that's not what restraint theory suggests. Okay, so next we're then going to look at the second reason why diets fail, and that is denial. Denial is the second way in which we can explain why some diets may fail. The idea here is that if you deny something, it actually tends to have the opposite effect. So if you stop yourself from having something, you tend to really want it more. And obviously, if we're talking about eating behaviours, this works in terms of pizzas and chips and crisps. If you try to stop yourself having those, you actually end up then craving them more. You think about them more often, and so therefore you end up giving in and you end up having them. And so that can explain why diets may fail if you particularly deny something. Also works in relationships, so that's why if you play hard to get, that often works, because you want something you see as unattainable and you stop yourself having. Obviously, in the terms of dieting, you're putting this restriction in there yourself. So you're saying to yourself, right, I want to diet, I want to lose weight, or whatever reason you have for dieting, so therefore I'm not going to have these things, and then you start thinking about these things. This has been termed as the theory of ironic process of mental control, because it's ironic, because you're trying to stop yourself thinking about it, and actually you end up thinking about it a lot more. And obviously that has a role to play with restrained eaters, dieters, with bulimics, with anorexics, and so they end up actually being preoccupied with these things, and that could obviously end up ruining the diet. This has been tested, and this is where the white bear comes back in. So Wegner et al. Had two groups of participants. One group he asked to not think about a white bear and ring a bell every time they did, and the second he asked to think about the white bear and ring the bell every time they did. How are your tallies going now? Because what Wegner actually found was that the ones he told not to think about the bear tended to ring the bell a lot more times than when he told them to think about the white bear. And so that supports this idea that denial leads to actually thinking about things more often. And again, we can apply that to eating behaviours and dieting. Okay, to evaluate this idea, the idea of denial and dieting, well, Wegner himself says that, okay, there is an effect here, but actually it's small, and how much of an influence it does have to play on the failure of dieting is actually unknown, and obviously there needs to be kind of more research in that area. But there are research findings to support it, and so this is the main, I guess, main evaluative point, main AO2 point, is that Sotens et al. Did support this with other research, and so there is some other research support for the theory that denial has an impact to play on failure of dieting. What happened here was that they found that restrained eaters, so dieters, tended to the restrained eaters who overate, they tended to be the ones that were trying to suppress the food. So the restrained dieters who weren't in denial, they did fine and they could diet, but it was the restrained eaters who had tried to suppress the thought, so who used denial, they were the ones who overate more often. And again, that supports the idea that denial has a role to play in the failure of dieting. So we've got those two things then. We've got restriction and denial, and so which account for the failure of dieting. We now need to go on and look at, well, what successful diets look like. So I hear you scream, what does work when it comes to dieting? Well, the one thing that seems to be key is detail, paying attention to detail. And so the idea is that it's not just the food in general that you eat, it's exactly what you're eating, how much of it, what's in there. So rather than just saying, oh, I'm going to have another salad, you're actually thinking about, oh, okay, well, there's rocket in here, there's a little bit of olive oil, it's tomatoes, onion, and maybe varying it up each time. Whereas if you're just trundling through, not really thinking about meals, that's when you tend to fall off the wagon. Whereas if you're actually paying attention to the finer details of what you're eating and when you're eating, that tends to be the key. So Redden in 2008 conducted a bit of research into this and had two conditions, 135 participants, and each of them were given 22 jelly beans. In the first condition, they were just given general information about these jelly beans. Right, you're going to have another jelly bean, this one's number 7. In the second condition, they were given more detail, so they were told, oh, this is the cherry flavoured jelly bean, not easy to say, cherry flavoured jelly bean, number 8, or this is the bright red one. So they're given a little bit more detail about what they were eating, although both conditions were eating the same, actually the same jelly beans. And what they found was that participants in group 1 got bored more quickly and rated the jelly beans as not tasting as nice, whereas participants from group 2 preferred the taste and enjoyed the task more. So this supports the idea that detail is key when it comes to successful dieting, detail in what you're actually eating. As well as this, the idea has come now that it's not about diets. It's not about a fad, right, I'm going to just eat grapefruits or just eat cabbage for this particular time. It's about lifestyle and actually being educated about food and exercise and looking at it in the long run in terms of how you eat in general. And the idea here is obviously getting a good mix of physical exercise, having support in terms of groups, self-monitoring in terms of maybe measurements and scales and things like that. And actually it's not the idea of a diet, but a general healthy eating plan that will sustain you for your lifestyle. And there are lots of successful people coming up are making a name for themselves at the moment with these sorts of things. One of them is Joe Wicks. You've got a picture of him here, known as the Body Coach, and that's the kind of thing that he does. So if you look for him on Instagram or something, you'll see that he promotes a healthy eating lifestyle as what mixed with good exercise, and it's about macronutrients and when you eat, and they've got lots of support. People comment on the Instagram posts, and people are encouraged to make their own Instagram pages when they're on the plan as well, so that adds to the group and individual support, and he's seeing great results So that seems to be the way forward in terms of successful dieting. As an evaluation of detail being key for the success of dieting, then you may have seen in recent media, magazines, TV, for example, there have been TV shows that have focused on healthy eating and this overall approach, focusing on the detail, super size versus super skinny, things like that. They look at the excesses either way, obviously, eating too much or too little, and look at this healthy, balanced lifestyle. And again, they kind of conclude that it's important to look at the individual, look at overall, and make sure that there's an awareness of the regulation of the body in terms of hunger and satiety levels, and working towards these signals. There has been a meta-analysis of the healthy eating programs are known as anti-dieting, so they're against kind of the Atkins diet or particular diets. It's all about the lifestyle. And Higgins and Gray conducted a meta-analysis and found that participants on these healthy lifestyles improved on healthy eating and psychological being, as well as weight stability. So they weren't yo-yo dieting, going up and down, rather than weight change itself, which is what kind of Atkins and Weight Watchers and Slimming World are all about. You tend to find a sharp weight drop, and then they'll put that back on again. Whereas the healthy living type of approach tends to be more of a stable weight, and so it might be a better way to look at. Okay, so moving on then, we'll look at IDA, Issues, Debates and Approaches, which is important for your PSYA3 to access those top grade bands. And this goes for overall in terms of both the types of failure of dieting, so denial and restraint, as well as the detail in the success of dieting. So the first point is that the research tends to be quite culturally biased. It tends to be quite Eurocentric and doesn't tend to take account of how others eat. So we haven't got a view of how humans eat across the world. It tends to be quite European studies that we've looked at here. And actually Park et al. Found that in different cultures and different countries there tends to be different makeups of kind of diets and how people eat, and actually they found that Asian adults are more prone to obesity than Western adults and Europeans, and so that may well change the success and failure of dieting. So the results that we found here and the findings here aren't necessarily applicable across the world. So that's one of your IDA points, the cultural bias. The other is gender bias, and again we'll find this with a lot of the eating topic. There tends to be a lot of focus on females, and that tends to be because maybe they're more interested in this. And again, we looked at in the last video about why that may be. But they then tend to volunteer for the research more, and so we've got a good idea about how females diet and why it works and doesn't work for them, but maybe not males, and that is an issue because actually weight and dieting are important for males as well, and actually excess weight is more detrimental to males than it is females, and so it is important to know how both genders should be dieting and shouldn't be, and so that's why the gender bias is an issue here. But it's getting better, and obviously researchers are now aware of these biases in terms of culture and gender, and research is being conducted as we speak to address that. So hopefully in the future we'll know a little bit more about that. Another issue is determinism, and all of what we're speaking about here has a lot to do with the environment. It's saying that the individual has a role to play. There's a lot of free will involved there, whereas actually there is some truth in the idea that some people put on weight more than others, and some people find it harder to diet and harder to lose weight than others, and so no matter how much they diet and the different factors are going to have a role to play. There's something known as lipoprotein lipase, which regulates how much fat the body absorbs, and different people have different amounts of this, and that's obviously going to affect their weight. And so this is not saying that this is these theories aren't applicable to everyone, because there's some sort of determinism in there in terms of if they're biologically set up to have more weight. Obviously it's going to be harder for them to diet. And finally, a lot of accounts that we get from dieting tend to be anecdotal. They tend to be individuals' personal stories, which is fine. But the issue with that, obviously, as psychologists and trying to be scientific, anecdotal accounts can be biased. Maybe they're quite subjective and not objective. We don't know everything's controlled. We don't know we're getting the correct information. It could be that memory might have been affected, and so they might not remember what actually happened during the dieting or not. And so anecdotal accounts can't really be trusted, and we would prefer to stick to scientific information and scientific studies, although as we've looked at through this, there are studies there, and the research that I've presented today have all been studies, but kind of on a day-to-day basis, whether diets are successful or not tend to be quite anecdotal, and so that can cause some issues. Okay, so just as a quick recap then, for the success and failure of dieting side of the eating behaviours topic, we've looked at, under the AO1, we've looked at failure of dieting in terms of restriction doesn't seem to work, and denial doesn't seem to work, but detail does, and that tends to lead to successful dieting. And then for each of those, we've kind of looked at evaluating them. So the restriction, we looked at the Herman and Mack study with the preload and the non-preload groups, and we looked at methodological issues in that study in terms of kind of sampling and the split of groups and individual differences, cause and effect. Denial, there tends to be a fair bit of research support for that, so that's what you're going to use as your AO2 in your evaluation. And for your detail, the success of these healthy living programs, and that meta-analysis by Higgins and Gray goes to support that, so that's going to be your AO2. And we finished just then with a fair few IDA points, of which probably culture and gender bias I believe you'll probably be able to write a little bit more about. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, please pop them in the comments box, and I will try to reply. If not, hopefully someone else will be able to. And please tune in for the next video. And I'll leave you as always with the references. Again, this has been based on the Cardwell and Flanagan textbook, 3rd edition, and again I have used studies and the help of the resource community, who as always are fantastic in sharing their information. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you next time.